Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books Author Reading Series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real-live bookseller, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
Okay. So are we sitting or standing? How's this going to work? You want to arm wrestle? Yeah. Okay. Let's do it.
Phones come off, everybody.
Yeah. All right.
It's so embarrassing when you're doing a reading and your own phone goes off.
I know. Yeah. That's not going to look good. Okay. Great. Well, thanks for coming, folks. I appreciate everybody turning out today. I'm really happy to be doing this at this place in particular. Skylight's one of my favorite bookstores, and I probably don't have to tell you guys that a bookstore like this, as hard as it is to survive in the age of Amazon, not only allows, browsing and discovering things accidentally, but it allows for real conversations, real community, real connection with human beings over culture. It's not just about algorithms and AI recommending things. It's a real encounter between human beings and culture. There's less and less of that in the world these days, so I'm quite pleased to be here with Janet and the rest of you to talk about this stuff. So, Janet, I'll defer to you for now.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to be here as the interrogatory person. There we go. And happy to be interrogating Scott on his book, Culture Crash, The Killing of the Creative Class. And I bet many people in this room are part of that equation. Scott's veteran journalist, specializing in arts and culture, former arts reporter for the LA Times, has written on music and culture for Salon.com, New York Times, and GQ, runs the blog Misread City about culture in Los Angeles, and Culture Crash. A hardworking LA Times reporter, he got caught up in the tidal wave of layoffs in 2008, which saw a reduction of reporters, downsizing of the paper, and the mismanagement era of Sam Zell. But was part of a larger gutting of American journalism. In the 4 years between 2008 and 2012, saw a cut of 3/4 of the reporting jobs in America. And he began to examine the phenomenon of the implosion of jobs in cultural fields across the board, from the death of the recording industry to the closure of the newspapers to reporting on arts, not only the drawing up of paid work for a cultural producer, the writer, the reporter, the musician, the actor, but also all the people who support that work, the video store clerk, the bookstore, all kinds of knowledge workers who put culture into our hands, printers, drivers, distributors. The issue has more doors than an advent calendar. So we were talking about which end of the elephant do we begin with now? And I thought, what interests me about the book, I mean, everything interests me about this book. This could be a class. This could be an ongoing seminar for the next. Really, it's a way into the evolution of our culture in a very
grim and hilarious way.
Yes, thank you. And I think the thing I wanted to start with was talking about the collapse of the creative class being part of the collapse of the middle class. And let's start with that.
Right. Well, let me say too. You guys should all come back tomorrow to see Paul Beatty. His new book is awesome, and I've seen so many good people here, including David Mitchell, the English writer, and Amy Bender, and so many great people. So thanks again for supporting the series here. All right, the central idea of my book. It took me a while to get there, but I came into the book asking a bunch of questions. I mean, I had been aware I'd been a journalist and a record store shopper and reader of the newspapers and and writer of the newspapers, and I was paying attention in kind of a passive way at all the things that were happening. Around 2000, I read about how Napster and these other things were undercutting musicians' royalties. I heard about and earnings. I heard about. I saw record stores that I loved closing, Aaron's Records, Rhino Records. I had seen, when I moved to town, the first weekend I was here, I went to Midnight Special over in Santa Monica, which I thought was awesome. It's one of the reasons I moved to LA. So I saw this happening, and when I was at the Times, I wrote a lot of obits for bookstores, both Dutton's stores, which were wonderful places, and I know Doug a bit, and used bookstores, etc. So I saw, and I lived through it in the 6 years I was at the LA Times. I lived through something like 6 or 7 waves of layoffs, where there was you hear the rumor coming, people are going to lose their job, and then they do, and then there's these depressing lunches or drink ups afterwards, or it's going to really call me if if anything comes up. So I went through all this stuff kind of from the sidelines, and it became very tangible to me when I lost my job, and the woman next to me, Linnell George, who's also a writer who you may know, and my favorite ever editor, whose name is Maria Russo, also lost her job the same day. I mean, it was an incredible decimation. It became very tangible, so I was asking questions. What happened to the musicians, to the journalists, to the people on my block? This was fall 2008. The people on my block who were animators, who were photographers, etc., who were losing their jobs, who had their marriages, in some cases, fragment, who lost their houses, in some cases, medical insurance, blah, blah, blah. I wanted to know what was going on, so I started asking questions. And I did not realize until I was about halfway into this book that the real issue is not the only issue. There's a lot of things, and there's some things that are distinctive about being a creative being or being part of the creative economy, whether you're, a composer of symphonies like a John Adams or a bookstore clerk. You're kind of wired to a similar economy. So there are things that make you a little bit different than somebody who works on an assembly line. But the middle class and the creative class are deeply interwoven. They're they're vulnerable in the same ways. Part of the reason it took me so long to figure this out, I mean, I do this for a living, and I was like, years and years of thinking about these things before I really focused on it. And the writer Jaron Lanier, who some of you may know, who's an internet skeptic in Silicon Valley, the book Who Owns the Future is, I think, his latest, was one of the people who helped bring me around on this. And, so why does it seem so counterintuitive or so wrong or so strange to say that the creative class and the middle class are sort of bound up together and will go down to, rose together and will go down and are sort of coming down together? One of the things I try to do in the book is to bust myths. It's something that Barbara Ehrenreich is so good at. And I saw this book kind of in the line of Barbara Ehrenreich's work. So why is it so strange to say that? It's because historically we've thought of the artist, in sort of the notion of the artist over time, over the centuries, has changed in some subtle ways, some not so subtle ways. But there's always been this sense that since the Renaissance, at least, there's been this idea that the artist is this sort of ethereal being, whether it's Michelangelo back in Italy or, say, Jimi Hendrix more recently, this idea that the artist sort of walks on water, lives on this sort of exalted plane. And some of them do, and some of them are huge stars and live very different lives. Beyonce leads a very different life than Janet I do, for instance. But the artist, I'll speak for myself. I don't know about Janet. So there's been there's been this sort of this idea of the artist as a hero or a superstar, which is amplified by the fact that the people you read about, especially go pick up on the way out of here, pick up like Vanity Fair or really any newspaper, but especially Vanity Fair, New York Times T magazine, my old paper, the LA Times. It's the nature of media coverage, and there's nothing corrupt or evil about it, but it's the nature of media coverage, especially in a sort of, my son's here, so I won't use the term, the word that begins with star and ends with C-K-E-I-N-G. But in a sort of lifestyles of the rich and famous, celebrities are just like us kind of period where we're besotted with wealth and power, there's an obsession with these people at the very, very top of the of the economic and fame scale. So when's the last time you read a story in the mainstream press about visual art that wasn't about either A, auction prices, Christie's talking about, Francis Bacon gets 100 million, or is a profile of some dipshit like Jeff Koons, those are the people who get attention. It doesn't mean that there's not small reviews of a gallery show or a piece on a small indie rock musician or a jazz musician with a show at the Blue Whale. You get a little bit of that stuff, but increasingly you get a sort of winner-take-all thing. So that's why when you say middle-class artists, the artists I hear about are multimillionaires or they're self-branding people like Taylor Swift or whatever. So that's one myth that, like most myths, is based in something real. I mean, Michelangelo existed, Hendrix existed. These people were rich, they were powerful, etc. Hendrix's actually peak of wealth probably lasted about 2 years. He didn't really live to see it through. But let's say the Stones, are genuinely rich people who don't exist really in the economy I'm describing. But people like the Stones or Michelangelo are an incredibly tiny anomaly. The other myth, and this doesn't go back as far, and again, this is rooted in something real, but the myth that goes back to 19th century Paris, which is where we get a lot of our ideas of what the arts or the poet, the artist, etc. In 19th century Paris, the myth of the sort of Baudelairean myth, the myth of the Poe figure, the sort of dejected poet passed out in the gutter with, the bottle of absinthe, or something. And, so there's a sense that artists, whatever their genre, because a lot of these conceptions kind of cross over, fields, that the artist is a sort of dejected, genius who not only suffers for his or her art, but benefits from the suffering, right? That it's sort of like what they're meant to do, and if you take that away from them, you take away something real and sort of nourishing. So when you see one of these kind of depressing concerts for a musician, Victoria Williams or Vic Chestnut, who has since expired, or these other people who don't have medical insurance, what you're seeing is a culture that thinks that artists, and I mean a musical culture in some cases too, that think that artists don't follow the same rules as the rest of us, that when they're cut, they don't bleed. In fact, an artist, even if they're well regarded, getting written about in newspapers, getting played on the radio, etc., are still have to pay rent or a mortgage. They still need medical insurance, which until recently was difficult for independent people to get. If they have children, they still need to live in a safe neighborhood, have a place to send their kids. So we've overlooked for hundreds of years this middle place where not only a bookstore clerk or an architect or whatever, but musicians, novelists, short story writers, poets, etc., who you have heard of in a lot of cases, famous people, still live in the same kind of middle class world that most of the rest of us do. So when the middle class starts to get decimated by kind of Reagan-Thatcher, by an economic collapse, by a winner-take-all economy, that's something that impacts the creative class just as acutely and brutally as it does a school teacher or a worker on a Detroit assembly line.
Well, this idea that artists don't need to be recompensed for their labor is kind of an interesting one,
increasingly popular idea, too.
Yeah, let's talk about this idea of free, the culture of free. Information wants to be free, Evidently, from your book, I learned that Stuart Brand, who founded the Whole Earth Catalog, said in 1984, and I can't hear, he said, on one hand, information wants to be expensive because it is so valuable. The right information in the right place just changes your life. On the other hand, information wants to be free because the cost of getting it out is getting lower and lower all the time. So you have these two fighting against each other. When we hear that quote, information wants to be free, we never hear the rest of it.
Right, true.
It's like, I can remember in the 60s, it's like, steal this book. Stick it to the man, you're liberating it. You're not stealing it. It's for the people, and hijack it, And what's happened is that it's like technology has. It's like it's appropriated this sort of liberation thought into a very, very useful, attractive, and valuable for them.
Well, it's certainly useful for the people at Google and places like that, because it means that the books you write or, the records that, say, Jason Moran, who's a jazz pianist, make, the people who work at the labels or the publishing houses or the actual artists themselves, say you or a musician, those people are making less and less, but the people who own Amazon, Google, who handle fan pages at Facebook, all these other things, these people are making all the dough. I mean, I did and you can go to, I've never been there, but you read about the newly redesigned Google campus, and it's sort of head-spinning. I did an event at the Central Library with this guy, John McCrae, who's the lead singer of a band called Cake, and they performed at the Google campus a few years ago, and he said it was the closest thing he's ever seen to Rome at the height of its power. That you had, there was free sushi everywhere, there were bars making like hand-muddled everything, and it was around Christmas time, it was around Halloween, so they had pumpkins like as big as this tree. They had Hollywood makeup artists flown in to make people up as zombies or whatever thing they wanted. I mean, there's just kind of incredible bounty, and this is Northern California, and they've just got acres and acres and acres of green land stretching, almost all the way to the sea. It's kind of incredible. So I think it's interesting and important that this idea came out of hippie culture and that Silicon Valley is in Northern California. And the way you framed it is exactly right, that there was a sense in the 60s and 70s that you're doing something kind of socially progressive or kind of groovy or kind of individualistic to steal a book, and that drove some of the Napster thing too. Like a lot of these kids who were downloading, pirating music didn't think they were screwing their favorite musicians over. They thought they were doing something kind of edgy and that was part of DIY culture, part of alternative culture. What they don't realize is, you start to kill off the record labels, the publishing houses, especially the independent movie studios that make a Spike Jonze or a Richard Linklater or a Catherine Bigelow movie possible, then you're destroying the whole infrastructure that allows an artist to get paid. And it's not socially liberating for anybody except the big tech corporations.
Right.
It's a problem. So it's great news for them, and that's part of the reason they pump this stuff out. Wired magazine loves it. Fast Company loves it. Republican and in some cases Democratic politicians love it. This guy this 8-year-old who bought the New Republic, Chris, what's his name? He's probably as far left as anybody in this room on social issues. He's a married gay guy. He's all for legalize this, legalize that. But like most of these Silicon Valley billionaires, he wants to slice and dice the safety net. That's kind of the Silicon Valley ethos, and it's not the only problem. It's not the only thing I've written about, but it's part of the puzzle.
Right. Let's see. Let's talk about the Monsantoization of the cultural crop. Where we talk about...
I'll use that phrase in the next edition.
As we're, the whole internet, allows people from so many microclimates to have their work, to grow their non-hybrid seeds of their product. But so we think that the internet is helping these, this broad spectrum of art flourish in our time, but actually it's having the other effect that these amazing research you did, that 5% of bands touring make 90% of the concert dollar. That the top 10 bands take most of the concert money.
Yeah, the Eagles, the Stones, Billy Joel, yeah.
And it's with the devalorization, I'm learning all kinds of new terms, taking the money out of recording. People don't make money on recording. Everybody's releasing their stuff on SoundCloud, and they're being played on Pandora and Spotify, right. And they're not making a cent.
Yeah. Well, Yeah, I mean the situation with musicians is interesting, and the usual retort to that is, well, you've always had superstars, and the Stones and the Beatles were bigger than the other bands at the time, and there were small guys, middle guys. That's true. If you look at the numbers, I don't have it in front of me, but I do a chapter on indie rock. If you look at the numbers, it's changed starkly since the earliest date where I had statistics to compare was I think 1982, which you could argue was the beginning of the indie rock movement as we know it. It was when the Smiths were formed, and REM I think put out its first EP in the early 80s, which I'm not saying the early 80s was a utopian period. There's a lot of bad synth rock at the time, but the economic playing field was much flatter. What's happened in the arts, especially pop music, is similar to what's happened to, again, the middle class or the distribution of wealth in the country. You've always had rich people, you've always had poor people. You had a middle from about the 30s to the end of the 70s. The middle was growing, or at least was sort of robust and secure, and actually happened before Reagan came in, though he certainly sped it up. You started to have capital shifted up to the 1% and the poor growing as well. So the middle, whether it's musical middle, the midlist in literature, the literary middle, or the kind of broader American middle class has been decimated in that time. So the internet. The internet is way too big a subject for me to, in this book or, this afternoon, get into completely. It's done a lot of good things. There's stuff I like on the internet. There are things it's made possible. The problem is if you believe in say a brick and mortar bookstore like this one, or a record store, or a video store like Rocket Video or Vidiot's, which was just saved at the last minute, etc. If you believe in places like this, or if you believe in certain categories, like if you believe in the category of the author as a professional category, where an author writes books and makes money for them, or a musician, somebody who maybe studies for a few years, and I think of the musicians I love. You think of the number of years the Beatles were playing in Hamburg. You think of the years it took John Coltrane to get that technique on a saxophone. If you believe in the musician, the author as a professional category, then the internet, which again has done good things, the internet is not their friend. It's undercutting these places. I'm not the first person to say it, but if you look at the numbers, there's no way around it. I was in my 20s in the 90s, and in some ways my sensibility is that of the 90s, and Slate dissed me for being a 90s nostalgist. Jeb Bush recently said, is anybody nostalgic for the 90s? How could that be? Something like that. Thinking, that's the decade where there was the least dominance by a Bush president since the 70s. I do think there are several people who do think the 90s had some things going for it. Anyway, in the 90s, it really seemed, I remember when I was first put on the internet and got email, and when I first started working for a now defunct paper here, so many papers and weeklies and so on have been crushed by the internet. I worked for a weekly called New Times, which was owned by insane people, but I think we did some good work. I'm proud of what I did. I worked with smart people. We went after the Church of Scientology and wrote tough pieces about culture and politics. And anyway, but the internet revolution wiped that place out. And the sense that the internet was a bohemian, was creating a sort of mass indie culture, that there were small labels and you could publish your own poetry, desktop publishing, all this stuff. I remember that excitement. I remember believing it in some ways. A lot of musicians I spoke to who are now actively frustrated with the with the new world, were excited at the time. But the digital revolution has worked out about as well for the creative class as trickle-down economics worked for the middle class. It's not been a startling success as far as I'm concerned, and it's a big subject, but its impact on places like Skylight, on journalists, musicians, authors, etc., is quite brutal.
It's interesting. It's interesting to look at. I wanted to bring this up about blogging, about the HuffPo. We're writers. Many of you are writers here, and there. I have a blog. I know you have a
I
blog.
do too, yeah. And let me just mention, if you're interested in the stuff we're talking about today, my old blog, Misread City, has a lot of stuff about L.A., West Coast, but the current blog, Culture Crash, you can Google it, and find, my name, and you'll find it, is about this stuff. I try almost every day to post on some of the stuff we're talking about today. Anyway, go on.
So there's this, I remember when the Soviet Union collapsed, and Russians would go to work for months without a paycheck. And I remember saying only a Russian would go to work and not get paid. Americans would never work for free. How many of you have been an intern? How many of you blog? How many of you have written for the HuffPo and all this?
Yeah.
You know, why are we? It's like we're complicit in our own demise.
There's a movement on Facebook. I think it was started by, if not started by, at least kind of pushed along by a music writer who I really love named Barney Hoskins, who has a book called Waiting for the Sun, which I think I bought here actually, which is about the history of rock and R&B in LA going back to the 40s. But Hoskins and others run something on Facebook called Stop Working for Free, which is an important movement that I think is generating energy. There's a similar related movement that's mostly musicians, but it's starting to accumulate journalists and others, called the Content Creators Coalition, which I urge you to check out. A number of people, Roseanne Cash is a member, Mark Rebo, the jazz guitarist, is an important member, or I think he's a vice president, and John McCrae of Cake, who I mentioned, and a number of really substantial people are in that group, and they're doing benefits and trying to accumulate some political momentum. I want to, because Carrie has tugged my sleeve, sort of. I'm going to answer a question that Janet didn't ask, but which, yeah, exactly. I'm sure it's on her mind. We need to speed this ahead because I need to have time to sign. But, the question that I think is related to what you just asked is, why did this happen, and why does it take me, to answer this? Why 7 years or 8 years into the recession are we, in some cases for the first time, talking about the plight of architects, of record store clerks, of musicians, et cetera? I don't mean there haven't been specific conversations within, jazz players talking among themselves about how tough it's gotten to make a living in jazz or whatever, or poets or whatever. I'm talking about a larger conversation in the press, on radio, et cetera. Why is it taking so long? Why has there not been any kind of legislation or other kinds of support? So I was asking myself, as I wrote the articles in Salon.com that led to this book, I was asking, why has it gotten so bad? I mean, I'm seeing it all around me. I lived in a neighborhood in Glendale, which we eventually had to leave because the bank pushed us out, where half the people I knew were creative class people, again, animators, writers, photographers, et cetera, whose careers just collapsed. And I was seeing this all around me, but not hearing about it or reading about it in the press. So, why is it? So I'm going to read a few pages, and then depending on how much time we have, maybe I'll ask Janet a question, and then we'll do a few questions from the audience. So this is just going to read a couple pages from a chapter called Idle Dreamers. It's about halfway through the book. It's called Idle Dreamers, Curse of the Creative Class. And I use a quote from Paula Fox from the novel Desperate Characters. So it says, "There was a siege going on. It had been going on for a long time, but the besieged themselves were the last to take it seriously." So the chapter begins this way. "They're pampered, privileged, indulged, part of the cultural elite. They spend all their time smoking pot and sipping absinthe. To use a term that's acquired currency lately, they're entitled. And they're not, after all, real Americans. This is what we often hear about artists, architects, musicians, writers, and others like them. And it's part of the reason the struggles of the creative class in the opening years of the 21st century, a period in which an economic crash, social shifts, and technological change have put everyone from graphic artists to jazz musicians to book publishers out of work, aren't being taken as seriously as they deserve to be, or worse, have been shrugged off. Neil Young and Bruce Springsteen write anthems about the travails of the working man. We line up for the revival of Death of a Salesman. John Mellencamp and Willie Nelson hold festivals and fundraisers when farmers suffer. Taxpayers bail out the auto industry and Wall Street and the banks. There's a sense that manufacturing, or the agrarian economy, the old family farm, is what America is really about. But culture was, for a while, what America did best. We produce and export creativity around the world. So why aren't we lamenting the plight of its practitioners? The Bureau of Labor Statistics confirms that creative industries have been some of the hardest hit, beginning during the George W. Bush years and continuing through the Great Recession. But when someone employed in the world of culture loses a job, it's easier to dismiss or sneer at their plight than when it happens to, say, a steel worker or an auto worker. Musicians, actors, and other artists we hear about tend to be fabulously successful, but the daily reality for the vast majority of the working artists in America has little to do with bling. Artists in the Workforce, a report released by the National Endowment for the Arts in 2008, before the Great Recession sliced and diced this class, showed the reality of the creative life. Most of the artists surveyed had college degrees, but they earned less than the average professional, with a median income in 2003 to 5 of $34,800. Dancers, on average, made a mere $15,000. More than a quarter of the artists in the 11 fields surveyed live in New York and California, two of the nation's most expensive states where the money runs out fast. I'm going to jump ahead a page or two and then close out. I talk about Puritanism's country, obviously, founded by, we call them Pilgrims, which sounds a lot more benign than Puritans, who were dangerous religious fanatics who tore the pews out of churches because people sang there and smashed the stained glass in Catholic churches in England. I sort of describe them a little bit, and then I jump ahead. I say, we don't wear buckles on our hats anymore. Even coonskin caps have fallen out of style. But these latent notions of human nature and the American mind have taken a great step forward or backward recently. Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew were demonizing long-haired bohemians, know-it-all professors, journalists, and other seditious types since around the time of Woodstock. The origins of this kind of right populism seems to go back to the segregationist hero George Wallace, the Alabama governor who denounced civil rights workers as pointy-headed intellectuals. Agnew added effete core of impudent snobs and media elite to the language. But these seeds of suspicion and antipathy really blossomed with the invention of the term cultural elite. During the Murphy-Brown Wars of 1992, Vice President Dan Quayle spoke at the Commonwealth Club of California, connecting the Los Angeles riots to a group sitting, quote, in newsrooms, sitcom studios, and faculty lounges all over America. They were supposedly jeering at regular people. We have two cultures, he said, the cultural elite and the rest of us. Thus was the very word elite severed from its previous associations, many of them positive, with skill and accomplishment, or wealth and explicit power. Quayle was, after all, not only a vice president, but a wealthy man who came from several generations of money. Such attacks on the elite also oriented the resented group around education, culinary taste — critics always seem to describe these elites as drinking white wine or lattes — and attraction to culture. Presumably, this cultural elite was driving to the opera in its Volvos, somehow managing to sip both a cappuccino and laugh at regular people at the same time, while dreaming up new ways to undermine the American way. While the cultural left has led assaults on the literary canon or the race and gender of artists whose work hangs in museums and so on, it's rarely duplicated the anti-intellectual populism of the far right quite so well. Cultural elite, says Jonathan Lethem, is a code word for people who are getting away with something for far too long. It's a term of distrust. You can almost hear a plan for vengeance in it. Republican politicians hardened these impulses and made them more virulent and paranoid. So I'll stop there. How much time have we got, Janet?
Don't know.
Okay, so let me throw one at you, and then we'll get some questions from the audience and do some signing. What brought you into this? I started to hear, you started reading your blog around the time of the Hachette case, but as a novelist, you're somebody, I knew your name before I met you. You're one of the successful, kind of famous LA novelists. Why is this stuff touching somebody like you, who I think has, a hit movie being made of one of your, you've had one movie already, of another one, you're a well-known California writer. How does this stuff impact you, and what brought you into it?
Well, I'm a humanist above all, and just trying to fight for...
I'm all for that.
See, if this is a Russian audience, I could say the soul of, the soul of the country, and nobody would be upset with me. America, you got to be careful because we're a market. Everything is market. Right. The Oscars this year announced people biggest box office, blah blah. And I'm like,
yeah.
That's amazing. Is this where
that's
we're
when they're
at?
not? That's when they're not talking about what various people are wearing at the Oscars.
I'd
It seems to dominate
what
90% of our movie coverage.
I'd much rather what they were wearing. That there's more to a person than market. What is you can't. Not everything is marketizable. And people need things. When 9/11 happened, I bet this bookstore was full of people. Yeah. People were reading serious literature immediately. They needed it. Mm-hmm. They wanted to read Whitman. They wanted to read Steinbeck. They wanted to, they wanted to read Shakespeare. There is a need. Civilization exists.
Yeah,
Society exists.
I remember the week after that, at the risk of branding myself as an evil elitist, I was at LA Opera seeing one of the shorter Wagner operas, which means it only took 3 hours. I think it was, which one was it? Lohengrin or something that Kent Nagano conducted. And it was, I think for me and a lot of people in the audience, it was the first kind of big grouping, first big assembly we'd gone to after 9/11, and seeing something that, Wagner was no prince, but that engaged big ideas and that engaged notions of culture and what does it mean to be human, all that. It was this incredible, not quite a catharsis, but it was something that you couldn't get without culture and without a live audience around it.
Right, so it's like what helps us become more human? It's not, the constant stream of celebrity culture, all that stuff. When people are in crisis, they turn to culture, to real culture, to civilization, to the roots. They're reading that book, the John Adams book. They're reading about where did this country come from. They're reading things that feed the soul. And I'm interested in what keeps that alive, what keeps production of that alive in our time. That we don't go, it's not always going to be Shakespeare. There are people right now who are our Shakespeares, who are our Redwoods. They're growing right now. And how do we keep them alive so that they can grow and they don't have to leave art? If an artist has to spend 80% of their time as a salesperson and 20% of their time as an artist, are they going to be producing the great works of art they would be producing if they could be an artist 90% of the time and salesperson 10% of the time?
That's an excellent point. It's the same as politicians who spend all their time fundraising and can't do any actual governing. The same process is happening to artists.
And so I got involved. My publisher is Hachette, which was the weak gazelle far as Amazon decided to pick it out of the savannah of publishing to go after my publisher to get market share, to beat them down on ebook prices, which there are going to be more and more of the books are going to be ebooks.
Yeah, when you buy an ebook, a lot less of your money is, not that we get that much when you buy a hardback, but a lot less makes it to an author or a publisher when you buy an ebook. A lot more goes to the Amazon or whatever.
Right, the distributor is what's making the money these days. Yeah. So, I have a Kobo that I got here. Right. So Skylight gets a piece of every ebook that I buy. But what's happening is that Amazon, by sheer size, is able to make demands of the publisher, of the producer. They want a bigger piece. And they want, of course, the writer is going to get screwed the biggest. If I have a book that sells for $15, Amazon says, but we want to sell it for $7. The publisher says, no, we set the price. And Amazon says, no, we sell 60% of your books. Yeah. We want to set the price.
It's sort of a bully economy.
And they are willing to price under what things are worth. They're willing to lose money year after year after year for market share. The publishers can't do that. I can't live on negative numbers. Right. And my publisher is a guy named Michael Peach, who is kind of a hero.
Who edited David Foster Wallace and David Foster Wallace also, right? I'm thinking of the.
He is a crusader for the publishing industry, and he said no. And
or Hachette is French, so could you? How did the people back in Paris say it?
How do they say?
Yeah, I can't speak French. You probably can. That's what.
But he's the one who said no. And
in English,
it was tough. It was 8 months. Where they took all the pre-order buttons off. So it's like movies that have to open big the first. I mean, they played hardball in a million ways. That is tough on new authors. If people don't know you, if it's your first novel, and nobody can pre-order, then it doesn't, it just doesn't get out of the gate. It was really horrible. It was really horrible. But he stood fast, and I wrote a letter. I went to a 4th of July party, and under the, wave of patriotism, I wrote to Jeff Bezos. And I said, you need to protect, you, because of sheer size, you say that you have no interest in the business itself. All you are is the distributor. But by sheer size, you're already part of the equation. You cannot pretend that you have no influence in the publishing world. And you should step up to that responsibility and protect the soul. This is the soul of America. Of course, I got no response whatsoever. And that pissed me off. And then he did that thing where, in the newest wave of assault on the trying to beat my publisher into submission, they got. The writers got together and put an ad together in the New York Times, and some 1,000 writers put their names out there for Amazon to see. Retribution was possible, saying that they need to protect the American author and stop this hardball shit. And what Amazon did was it contacted all its self-publishers. And my apologies if any of you are self-publishers. I know some people in my family are self-publishers. But got them all worked up that somehow letting professional writers make a living in a mainstream publishing world is somehow dissing them, threatening them. Whereas Amazon sets their prices, Amazon does shit for them. They're never going to, very few of them can make a living, especially in fiction.
And everyone everyone who can, you hear about incessantly. It's what I call the Amanda Palmer, Horatio Alger phenomenon.
They shook the trees, they got the kind of the, I hate to say the wacko element of them excited. And self-publishing, there's a nice big bunch of them. And they gave my publishers email saying, write to this guy. So Michael got thousands and thousands and thousands of letters from these people saying that it's elitist and you don't need the middleman. They're trying to do to the book industry what happened to the music industry. And
journalism.
Get rid of the labels and just take all the money. So nobody gets paid. And Michael answered every single one of those emails, explaining the situation. People were writing back saying, I had no idea what was going on.
Interesting.
Really, he just, God. And I was so pissed at the tactics because my boyfriend has a book out, self-published, so he got the letter. The crazy letter from Bezos. And so I made my letter that I had written personally, privately. I made that letter public.
Wow.
And then I got all the hate mail from the people who were upset that there are professional writers who have been the elect to get by the gatekeepers. It's not Smaug. It's, these are not gatekeepers to keep people out.
Soren,
These are people who are trying to find what's best in our culture and make a. They don't
like
make
people
a
who
lot
work at a place like
money
this.
either. to keep that going, and he held fast, and they won.
Wow, awesome! I didn't know
They
that
won.
story.
But you can't. Are they really? Who's going to win in the long run? If you still buy stuff from Amazon,
Yep.
you're losing. If you
Right.
do Pandora, you are cutting musicians' throats. And that's it. Spotify. I've stopped using Google. I use DuckDuckGo. I don't give Google a penny. Screw them. I think that one of the difficulties is the fact that culture workers are middle class, are considered middle class. We're college educated. We're white collar. Blah blah blah. We are babies when it comes to labor negotiations. We are babies. We are wimps. We have no idea what to do with ourselves. We don't trust each other. We're atomized.
We fetishized independence so that any kind of collective action seems like some kind of Detroit working class thing that our families have risen above and we don't need. But in fact, if creative people can't get together and join hands, that's why this group I mentioned, Content Creators Coalition, which is one of several groups. But that's why a group like that is important, because
that's why
you
important.
will not by yourself fight Bezos and win. But maybe if all of the musicians and all of the authors and so on get together and become a force and can lobby Washington and so on and so on,
we're
then it
culture
becomes
workers.
a fair
We
fight.
can influence where it's not cool to use Spotify. You go to a party and somebody is using Spotify. It's like, are you kidding? Are you kidding? You're musicians. Get off of that.
Yeah.
I mean, we can influence thought in this culture, and that's but we have to maybe give up the middle class idea and start realizing we're not going to be in the 1%.
Right.
We're not.
It's a dangerous
Forget that
notion.
aspirational thing. Realizing that we are cultural workers, and that we do have some clout, but it's not as middle-class professors in the faculty lounge. It's getting together and saying, no, we're not going to adjunct for peanuts.
Right.
No, we're not going to
That's the next frontier, actually.
give stuff to the HuffPo for free.
Right.
But something like this that shows us that this is going around across the board.
Yeah.
And how it all fits together it's huge. It is huge.
Cool.
You've really opened the door to this discussion.
I hadn't known all of that story, Jen. I appreciate you telling it. I'm going to have to, I'm embarrassed to say, let's do one question, and then I'm going to sign books, and we can talk for a minute. Okay, your hand went up first, ma'am.
Janet, I so appreciate hearing you. It's always so nourishing hearing you talk. I actually listened to you at the library.
Oh,
and
cool.
You were so barraged by questions. Because when you got to the part about hope,
Right.
and you were talking a little bit about postmodernism, I thought as a woman and a reader of authors of color, that the canon that you advocate might be a little too white and a little too male. Postmodernism was dull, aside from some French feminisms and things going on early on. But it did break down.
Right, and your question?
And my question there is, you advocate going back to the canon, which sounded pretty white male to me, and also some kind of spiritual impulse. When I'm feeling, doesn't America need right now a real secular impulse, given the text?
So that's an interesting question. Let me pose the question. So this will make more sense if you read my book, but the question is about sort of, do we need a canon, and what's my vision for it, and do we need a spiritual or a secular impulse in this country? So the musicians and writers I like don't really matter all that much. I do think we need a canon, though. I don't think the canon there's no reason for the canon to be white, male, straight, anything like that. But if we look back at anything in American history, look at the list of American presidents, look at the list of famous baseball players for the first couple decades. It was white men. The canon is the same way. There's no reason for it to remain the same way. I'm not opposed to, Juno Diaz or Toni Morrison or Ursula Le Guin or whatever, or some of my favorite writers being in the canon. What I'm against is attacks from the left or the right. It doesn't matter to me. I'm on the left politically, but it doesn't matter to me where the attacks are coming from. An attack on the idea that the arts, literature, et cetera, have some kind of meaning and should be studied and held sacred. So when I say we need some kind of spiritual impulse, I don't mean we all need to go to church. I mean, I'm an agnostic myself. What I mean, and I think this country would be, if we just could sort of double down on the idea that our founders pushed, that the separation of church and state was essential, I think we'd be a lot better off. What I do think we need, and this comes back to what Janet was saying, is to recognize that the books on the shelf here, the pieces I'm going to go see played at Disney Hall in an hour, the people who work here, these are all things that are higher than and different than the marketplace or the market for tires or diapers or whatever. When I say we need some kind of spiritual connection or recognizing that culture is sacred, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about giving all your money to a mega church pastor who wants to buy a private jet, for instance, which is something that is just happening in Atlanta right now. So I think that we need to go back. We don't need to go back to having only, white male novelists. What we do need to go back to is an idea that literature, visual art, music, etc., whether it's Nina Simone or Miles Davis or Richard Thompson, that there's something that the highest thing, the most noble and in some ways inexplicable thing that a human being can do is to create enduring culture. That's what I'm hoping for, and that's really what this book is about. I should break there. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books Author Reading Series. Don't forget that you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.